Have you ever seriously thought about how a country that defined half of the 20th century, a superpower that put the first man in space and held the world in a state of nuclear tension, could just cease to exist? Subscribe for more stories that linger in your mind. The Soviet Union wasn't just a country, it was an idea. An empire built on a revolutionary promise. Its collapse wasn't like a company going bankrupt, it was like a planet vanishing from the solar system. What chain of events, from glorious revolution to brutal reality, led this titan to crumble from within? This isn't just a history recap, it's an autopsy of a superpower. The story of the Soviet Union doesn't start with a bang in 1922, but with the slow, agonizing decay of the Russian Empire. By the early 1900s, Russia was a study in contradictions, a vast empire ruled by an autocratic Tsar, Nicholas II, with a largely impoverished peasant population still living in near-feudal conditions. Humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, followed by the Bloody Sunday massacre where peaceful protesters were gunned down, shattered the myth of the Tsar as the benevolent little father. The final straw was World War I. The conflict drained Russia's resources, led to millions of casualties, and caused mass starvation on the home front. The empire was a powder keg, and Vladimir Lenin, a revolutionary intellectual exiled for his Marxist beliefs, was ready with the match. In October 1917, his Bolshevik Party, a radical socialist faction, seized power in a brilliantly executed coup. Their slogan, peace, land, and bread, was a perfect pitch to a population desperate for all three. This act gave birth to the world's first communist state. But the revolution was far from over. A brutal, multi-front civil war erupted between Lenin's Red Army and a loose coalition of anti-communist forces known as the White Army, who were backed by foreign powers like the USA, Britain, and Japan. After years of horrific bloodshed, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious, and on December 30, 1922, they officially formed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics (USSR), uniting Russia, Ukraine, Byelorussia, and other territories under a single, centralized communist government. After Lenin's death in 1924, a ruthless power struggle ensued. The obvious successor seemed to be Leon Trotsky, the brilliant strategist who built the Red Army. But it was the unassuming Joseph Stalin, the general secretary of the party, who masterfully used his bureaucratic position to build loyalty and sideline his rivals. By the late 1920s, Stalin was the undisputed dictator of the Soviet Union, and he would launch the country into its most transformative and terrifying era. Stalin was obsessed with a single goal: dragging the agrarian Soviet Union into the industrial age. No matter the cost, he believed the USSR was decades behind the West and that they had to catch up in 10 years or be crushed. His instruments were the five-year plans, a series of ambitious state-directed projects for rapid industrialization. Gigantic steel mills like Magnitogorsk rose from the barren steppe. Massive hydroelectric dams were built, and the nation's output of coal, oil, and steel skyrocketed. But this progress was fueled by human suffering. To fund it, Stalin implemented collectivization, forcing millions of fiercely independent peasants off their land and onto massive, state-controlled farms. This policy was an economic and human disaster. It destroyed agricultural productivity and was met with fierce resistance, which Stalin crushed with manufactured famines. The most horrific of these was the Holodomor in Ukraine, a man-made famine that killed millions and is now recognized by many countries as a genocide. Parallel to this, Stalin unleashed the Great Purge, a wave of paranoid terror that swept through the country. Old Bolshevik heroes, army commanders, intellectuals, artists, and millions of ordinary citizens were arrested, subjected to show trials, executed, or sent to the infamous Gulag labor camps. Stalin had built an industrial giant, but he did so on a foundation of bones. The ultimate test of Stalin's brutalist creation came on June 22, 1941, in a shocking betrayal of their non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, known in the USSR as the Great Patriotic War. This became the largest and deadliest conflict in human history. Despite Stalin's initial paralysis and catastrophic early losses, the Soviet system, with its centralized command of industry and the sheer resilience of its people, eventually ground the Nazi war machine to a halt. The battles of Stalingrad and Kursk were turning points not just for the war, but for world history. The Red Army then began its long, bloody push west, liberating Eastern Europe and ultimately raising the Soviet flag over the Reichstag in Berlin in May 1945. The USSR was instrumental in defeating fascism, but the cost was staggering. An estimated 27 million Soviet lives were lost. This sacrifice vaulted the Soviet Union to the status of a global superpower, second only to the United States. The end of the war ushered in not peace, but the Cold War, a nearly 50-year global standoff between the capitalist West, led by the US, and the communist East, led by the USSR. It was a war fought with propaganda, espionage, proxy conflicts in places like Korea and Vietnam, and a terrifying nuclear arms race. The world was divided by an Iron Curtain. Both sides knew that a direct conflict could lead to mutually assured destruction. This era also saw incredible scientific competition. The Soviets shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, in 1957, and sending Yuri Gagarin, the first human, into space in 1961. After Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev came to power and, in a secret speech in 1956, denounced Stalin's crimes, leading to a period of relative liberalization known as the Khrushchev thaw. But the limits of this thaw were brutally demonstrated when Soviet tanks crushed reform movements in Hungary in 1956 and later in Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring of 1968. Under the rule of Leonid Brezhnev, this established the Brezhnev Doctrine. The USSR would not allow any country in its Eastern Bloc to abandon communism. This period, from the late 1960s through the early 1980s, is known as the era of stagnation. The economy, built for heavy industry, failed to produce basic consumer goods, leading to long lines and chronic shortages. The system was sclerotic, run by a corrupt and aging leadership. The final act began with the appointment of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. A younger, more dynamic leader, Gorbachev knew the system was dying and believed he could save it through reform. He introduced two radical policies: Glasnost, openness, which allowed for unprecedented freedom of speech and criticism of the government, and Perestroika, restructuring, which aimed to introduce quasi-market elements into the stagnant command economy. He was not trying to destroy the Soviet Union, he was a true believer trying to save it. But he had opened Pandora's box. Glasnost revealed the horrific truths of the past and the deep failings of the present. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986, and the government's initial attempts to cover it up, became a devastating symbol of the system's bankruptcy. The new openness also uncorked decades of pent-up nationalism in the 15 republics that made up the USSR. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania began demanding independence. Meanwhile, Perestroika was a chaotic failure, dismantling the old economic system without a viable one to replace it, leading to even worse shortages and economic collapse. In 1989, the Brezhnev Doctrine crumbled as popular revolutions toppled communist governments across Eastern Europe, culminating in the symbolic fall of the Berlin Wall. In August 1991, hard-line communists, desperate to turn back the clock, launched a coup against Gorbachev. But the coup was poorly organized and famously defied by Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, who climbed atop a tank in Moscow and rallied the people. The coup collapsed in 3 days, but it fatally wounded the central government. Power shifted decisively to the leaders of the individual republics. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met and signed an accord declaring the Soviet Union dissolved. On Christmas Day, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, and the red Soviet flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the final time, replaced by the Russian tricolor. So, the Soviet Union wasn't defeated by an external enemy. It rotted from the inside out, collapsing under the immense weight of its economic failures, its political repression, and the irrepressible desire for national freedom. It was a grand, 70-year experiment in building a new kind of society that ultimately failed to deliver on its promises. A cautionary tale of how an idea that inspired millions could curdle into a stagnant reality. Maybe the biggest lesson is that no system, no matter how powerful, can survive when it loses the faith of its own people. And that's a fact worth subscribing for.